Amateur Traveler, episode 834. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about castles and closes, palaces and Presbyterians, Robert Burns, and Adam Smith as we go to Edinburgh, Scotland. This is Chris Christensen from Amateur Traveler. Let's talk about Scotland. I'd like to welcome back to the show Dan from the Zipping Around the World Travel Podcast. Dan has been on talking about Munich and the island of Samos in Greece before, and today he's come to talk to us about Edinburgh, Scotland. Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate you having me on again.
What is your connection with Edinburgh, Scotland here? Now, we're in 3 different countries that we've talked to you about.
Yeah, my connection is travel. My podcast is travel, yours is too, and it's a passion of mine. And this is a place that I've been recently that I thought, hey, let's see if Chris needs a new show, and here we are.
Excellent. And why should someone go to Edinburgh?
The history, if you like a little whiskey, if you like just greenery, it's just a wonderful place to go. The people are wonderful, English speaking, so it's easy for a lot of people to cast their net first. So all those things encompass why you'd want to go to Scotland.
I would have to say among the English-speaking peoples, the 2 places that I might have a little more trouble are Scotland and New Zealand. You have to listen a little closely sometimes.
Yes, I agree. And I've met some Scottish gentlemen actually in Munich one time in my life, and I couldn't understand them at all. And I thought everybody spoke that broken English or Scottish English, but they were. It was much
Scottish English.
It was much easier. Yeah, it was much easier in Scotland than what I thought it would be to understand them. So I think it just depends on where they live in the country.
Sure, I would think so. Yep. Excellent. Where are we going to start? What kind of itinerary are you going to recommend?
Yeah, let me lay this out real quick. Let's do like day 1 on the Royal Mile. Let's do kind of a day 2 to Edinburgh Castle. Let's do a day 3 rest of Edinburgh. Day 4, Stirling, Scotland. And day 5, which will be a quick little discussion, either a day trip to St. Andrews or even Glasgow, just depending on what somebody would want to do.
Okay. So you're starting us on the Royal Mile.
Yeah, we'll start on the Royal Mile. Chris, one thing, let's talk about maybe getting to Edinburgh, Scotland. I know some people will fly in. That's the easy part. We actually took a train from London. And just a little bit of insight there. You take the Northern Eastern Railway, and that's out of King's Cross in London. And I would just give somebody a tip that, hey, book your tickets early and get reservations. They are free when you get your tickets. We were there peak season, Chris. We were there in late June, early July, and I watched a gentleman hold his baggage for 2 hours on his lap because there was no place for luggage. Make sure that you book a reservation and get on the train early. Don't get on the train late.
And you're at King's Cross. That goes from gate 9 3/4, as I recall.
Those trains actually go out to another part of the world, but you're in that same train station, yes.
Got it. Okay. My mistake.
Okay. So let's start at the Royal Mile. Let's go ahead and start.
What is the Royal Mile, first of all?
Yeah, the Royal Mile. It is a stretch of street/road that runs from Edinburgh Castle down to Holyrood Palace. And Holyrood Palace is where the British monarchy stays when they're in, or the British royalty stays when they are in town.
Although when they're in town, they're more of the Scottish royalty, the descendants of James VI here at that point. But
okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for correcting me.
There's still the British royalty, but yep.
We will start at the top of the hill by the castle on the Royal Mile, and then we will walk our way down to the palace. And as you can imagine, we're up on a hill because we're in a defensive position, right? And one thing, if you're there in the middle of the summer, you're going to be a little bit bummed, in my opinion, because I was, because when you're there right in front of the castle, guess what you can't see? You can't see the castle.
Sure.
Because they build an arena that is temporary, because there is a big military tattoo competition in August every year up on the hill by the castle. So you don't really get a good look at the castle when you're almost right in front of the castle.
And you see a tattoo competition. That sounds like there's a bunch of people who are comparing their tattoos of sailors' arms and anchors, but that is not what you mean by a military tattoo.
That is not what I mean by a military tattoo. That is a performance of music or a display of armed forces, is a military
Okay, you looked this
I
up.
did. I asked the lady standing there, and then I re-looked it up. And this encompasses bagpipes and drums, of course, in the Scottish territory. Happens every year. So basically, I'd say during the holiday season, this arena is going to be up and obscuring your view. If you're there in the winter, it's not going to be there and you're not going to know what I'm talking about. I think they told me it took 6 weeks to build and 1 week to tear down. So it's pretty big, thousands of people. And also, if you're coming in the summer, they have major concerts there. So you could go online and look to see who's going to be playing during the time that you're there. I know my daughter saw one of the bands. She said, "Oh, I wish I'd have known that they were playing. I'd have loved to have seen them." So pretty high-end bands go there before this August military tattoo competition.
Okay.
All right. So an overall, I'll say, discussion or thought on the Royal Mile is, man, there are a lot of attractions. There's whiskey shops, gift shops, kilt shops, restaurants, and pubs. So it's pretty touristy, but I'm going to hit the things that are, I'll say, more historic and a little bit less touristy than telling you about 100 of the gift shops that are on the Royal Mile.
Okay.
We're at the top and we're starting to head down, and there is something called Gladstone's Land. And what that is, it's a 17th century merchant's house that you can visit.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, it has hand-painted ceilings from around the 1620s. So that is an interesting little side trip. It's about 7 pounds or 8 pounds to get in. Probably take you 30 minutes to get through it and give you a really good understanding of what a merchant's house would look like in the 17th century. And of course, this was all merchant houses at one point in time. This was the heart of the city. Mm-hmm. From there, let's walk to a tavern. And I mentioned there's lots of pubs and taverns, but this one really caught my attention when I was there, really interesting, called the Deacon Brodie Tavern. One thing I'll say about these taverns that are on the Royal Mile and just off of the Royal Mile is make reservations. This is a very populated place and you need to make reservations. I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute, a little bit deeper detail. But the Deacon Brodie Tavern, it's relatively new. It was built in 1806. So it's new on the hill. But the interesting part of it is it was named after one of the famous sons of the city, Deacon William Brodie. And actually, this story kind of inspired Robert Louis Steven's Jekyll and Hyde. Mr. Brodie was born in 1741. He was in a group of skilled carpenters known as the Guild of Wrights. And by day, so he was this kind of respectable citizen. He was a member of the town council. But by night, he became involved in gambling and drinking. And so to pay his debts, he had to resort to a life of burglary and crime. And by 1786, he had a small gang of criminals working in the city. So during the day, he was a model citizen, and at night, not a great guy. On the sign, it's a two-sided sign. On one part of the sign, he's this great citizen. On the other part of the sign, he's a robber, and they got a little mask over his face like the Lone Ranger or something like that. So really interesting story about this Deacon William Brodie. And so they have the tavern named after him, a very popular place. Here, we're going to take a quick right off of the Royal Mile as we're heading down because we're going to go to two locations. We're going to go to something called Greyfriar Bobby, and it is the most photographed statue in all of Edinburgh, and it is a Scottish Terrier. And you'll see it on buses and on signs. You'll see it all over the city. So eventually you'll have to figure it out. I know I didn't know anything about it when I arrived. And after I saw it on like the 18th bus, I said, well, I got to figure out what this is. And the story behind the dog is his master passed away on this spot, and he didn't leave this spot for the next 10 years until he died. So he was this icon of the city. And this is from hundreds of years ago. So everybody's there, rubs on the statue. So he's a bronze statue that's very polished, as you can imagine. And lots of people are taking that picture. So if you're into Instagram, that's one of the Instagram pictures. And then, Chris, across from that is the National Museum of Scotland. And it has a whole hodgepodge of things in it. So it has Scottish history, Scottish royalty history. It has an animal world, I'll call it, like a natural history museum. It's got some Egypt history, some East Asia history. It's got it all. The good thing about it for you or your family is it's free admission. If it's a rainy day, this really might be a great place to hit. When we were there, we had great weather, no rain, which is probably almost unheard of when you're in Scotland, or at least when we were in Edinburgh, we got rained on a little bit later in Scotland. And it's also a good place for a bathroom break. Even if you don't want to go and see the museum, it probably has really good public bathrooms for you.
Okay. Always good.
Yeah, especially when you're in Europe. Finding a bathroom can be a little challenging, I find. We can backtrack and go back up to the Royal Mile. And next is the St. Giles Church. It dominates the Royal Mile from a church perspective. This church was founded in 1124 by King David I and has been a working church for almost 900 years. Really impressive church on the Royal Mile. And I'll talk a little bit more about it as we get into some of the other characters that lived in Edinburgh. Chris, behind the church, you will find something called the Meerkat Cross, and it's relatively new too. It was built in 1885. And here you will find walking tours around the city. Specifically, one I remember is ghost tours at night. So if you're into ghost tours in a very old city, this is the place to go. My kids were interested in going, but we actually didn't make a ghost tour. So that's a real obvious spot for tours leaving, walking tours and ghost tours leaving the city.
Okay.
And then right after that, there is a statue of a gentleman, and that statue is to Adam Smith. And he's a pretty important person in Edinburgh, and I'm sure you've heard of him as well.
I have. In fact, there's a very interesting, for those people who think they know Adam Smith, a very interesting series recently on the Freakonomics podcast. They've been talking about Adam Smith and some of his other writing that he did, not just about economics, but also as a philosopher. And so an interesting character and apparently often taken out of context.
Another interesting thing about the statue is it might be really easy to find because he might have a traffic cone on his head. That seems to be the Scottish thing to do to statues. So for a couple of days that we were there, he had a traffic cone, and for one day he did not have a traffic cone. So I saw that on a couple different statues. So he might be really easy to find for people.
All right.
And yeah, a little bit more about him. He's known as the father of capitalism, and he wrote The Wealth of Nations, and that was back in 1776. So he's considered the first modern economist, and that basically he started that academic discipline. So if you're into economics and capitalism, he was the man and he wrote the book.
Indeed.
Now, Chris, as you're walking down the Royal Mile, you have all these buildings and then you have these alleyways branching off and going downhill, if you will, right? Now, these alleyways are known as closes or close, but that's one thing that I did learn and of that word. And those are really interesting to walk down and explore the rest of that old city. There's some bars and restaurants down there, but I would say it gets you a little bit off of that touristy place and into other interesting areas of Edinburgh. So there's a lot of closes as you're walking down the Royal Mile to explore as well.
Okay. Was there any particular one that stands out?
There was, and that's because there was a restaurant that we went down one of these closes, and I don't have the name of the close, but the restaurant's name was the Devil's Advocate. And we stayed in an Airbnb, Chris, and our host told us of this location. That's why I wanted to tell everyone to make reservations, because we got in off the train after a 4-hour train ride from London and thought, okay, let's go and have dinner there. And we got there about 4 p.m. and they said, no reservations for the rest of the night. And they stay open till 1 a.m. And I'm like, nothing? They're like, nothing. The Royal Mile is very popular. And so we made reservations for noon the next day to have lunch there. So if you want to go sit in these places and have a drink and stuff, I would say get your name on a list, get online, and get a reservation. And as a matter of fact, the Devil's Advocate was very nice. Good food, good drinks, nice whiskey list for you to have a taste of their Scottish whiskeys, and very popular. And again, it was down one of these closes and just that tighter winding downstairs. You got to have good physical skills to be running around Edinburgh and that part of the world.
Okay.
Next, going down the Royal Mile is John Knox's house. He was a Puritan reformer. and the home was dating
Mm-hmm.
back to 1470. And he was the pastor at St. Giles Church. So that's why I wanted to come back to St. Giles Church. He was born in 1514 and passed away in 1572, just to give you an idea of when he was running around this part of the world. And again, he was the leader of the Protestant Reformation in Scotland. So they were under the Church of England, and then he became the founder of, I think, the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Then from there, you can keep walking, and it's getting a little bit flatter now. You've come off the hill just a little bit. And the next item of interest for me was the Canongate Church. It's a little bit smaller church than St. Giles. And here you will find Adam Smith's grave in the cemetery. So you have his statue up higher on the hill, and you have his grave down lower on the hill at Canongate Church. And it's easy to find because it has a gate around it, and it's a little bit bigger than all the other graves in the cemetery. So it's pretty easy to find.
Okay.
And then if it's raining, and if you want to understand more about the history of Edinburgh, across the street is the Museum of Edinburgh, and it's yet another free entry museum. So something else for you to do.
And is that mostly history then in the Edinburgh
Yes.
Museum?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
And at the end of the Royal Mile, now we are at the new Scottish Parliament building. And Chris, this does not fit in the Royal Mile. Its architecture is ultra modern.
A little modern,
super modern, and it's a little bit out of place, frankly. I'm sure with the age of the Royal Mile, maybe in 700 years, it might look really old and interesting as well. But it is super modern and just a bit out of place here. They actually give free guided tours there as well. I think they're like 45-minute guided tours. I know we ran in just to get some waters. They have a little gift shop and stuff. You will have to go through a metal detector and stuff, as you can imagine, to a government building like that. But it's really open to the public. And again, if it's a rainy, drizzly day, it might be a nice place to get out of the rain as well. And then at the end of the Royal Mile stands right in front of you the Palace of Holyrood that we've already talked about once. Again, a 16th century royal palace. And in that you can visit royal apartments, great gallery, throne room. They have some jewelry to view, and they also have some royal gardens. We did not pay to go in. It's probably about £20 per person. You can look through the gate and get a feel of the place, if you will. We were dog tired by that time of the day. And there is a nice cafe right in front of it if you want to rest or grab lunch or just get a coffee or something like that.
Excellent. We were talking earlier about the current royal family, so that'd be King Charles at the time of this recording. And he is a direct descendant of James VI, who united Scotland and England. And I don't know why I wasn't sure, but there was all of the royal line moving to Germany that threw me off a little bit there as the Saxe-Coburg family came in, but they were descendants of James VI, and so they are the royal family of Britain, but also the royal family of Scotland, and therefore of Great Britain.
Okay. It's a hard family to get your head around. It's complicated. It's very complicated. It's very long, and it's very complicated.
I mean, at one point, Victoria was the aunt for half the royal families in Europe.
That's kind of how they kept the peace, right?
Well, except it didn't work.
They tried. Let's start a second day here, because you can spend all day on the Royal Mile doing all that. And we didn't talk about how much time you or your kids may spend in whiskey shops and or gift shops buying the tchotchkes that you want to take home.
When your kids were spending time in the whiskey shops, how old are your kids again?
They were not spending time in it. They were in the gift shops. There you go.
Got it. Just trying to parse that.
So we have Edinburgh Castle as our main item for today. Buy your tickets a couple of days early, if not earlier. We thought we'd wait until the day before, and we tried to buy them. And there were several hundred tickets left we saw, and they were taken. So we got stuck, and we had to go the next day. Okay, so don't think you're going to show up and get tickets, especially in the high season, as you can well imagine. Again, it's a touristy place. Mm-hmm. So the first thing you'll walk through is that arena, that military tattoo arena. and you're going to pass the statue of Robert the Bruce. And he was the King of Scots from 1306 to 1329. He led Scotland during the First War of Scottish Independence against England. There's always been a little bit of a rift between those two areas. And he fought successfully during his reign to regain Scotland's place as an independent kingdom and is now revered as a Scottish hero. So there's a big statue of him as you get to the guard gate. And then you go through the guard gate or the gatehouse. And one thing about the castle is you basically spiral counterclockwise upwards through the castle. That's the way it runs. And as we talk about these items of interest, that's the way that we'll be walking through the castle. Because if you look on a Google Maps, it all looks flat. And I can assure you, it is not all flat. Definitely a spiral up, a little bit of walking. It'll take you anywhere from 3 hours to 5 hours to all day, depending on how much you like museums and like reading about museums and stuff like that. There is a cafe on the grounds, so you don't have to worry about where am I going to eat or something like that. Excellent views of the city. And when you're overlooking the city, for the most part, you'll be overlooking the north side of the city into the bay. You're going to be looking over Princess Street Gardens, and I'll mention that several more times in this podcast. So the first thing of interest, at least for me, was something called Mons Meg, and it is a massive siege cannon from 1449, and it was built in Belgium. And just to give you an idea, it has a 20-inch barrel. So it is a massive piece of steel. And from what I remember in the discussion, the engineering feat was just getting it to Scotland and some of the roads that they had to improve and build to get it out of Belgium onto a ship up to Scotland. Next, Chris, is something called the 1 o'clock gun. And this is something that I'd never heard of, but fascinated me after I learned about it here. So the 1 o'clock gun is actually a timepiece, if you will. It's a big artillery piece, but it helped ships in the bay after they had sailed in to understand what time of day it was. So at 1 o'clock, the gun would sound, and there's actually in the museum, there's charts to show if you're moored somewhere in the harbor, when you hear the gun, that's 5 seconds after they shot it or 10 seconds after they shot it. And then you would set your clock, accordingly. Really interesting. And this date, the firing of the gun dates back to 1861. And the gun is still fired every day at 1 p.m., except on Sundays and some holidays and stuff like that. So I found that pretty interesting. But frankly, I never heard the gun go off, so I don't know how loud it is. I would guess I was in a different location at 1 p.m. every day when they fired the gun. Next, as we're spiraling up, there is a National War Museum. And there's several museums within the confines of this castle. And this is an exhibition of Scotland's military history from the 17th century to present day, just to give you a little bit of information on it. The next museum is the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards Regimental Museum. And they have a history that dates back to over 340 years. And so this discusses their campaigns going all the way back into Waterloo. Quite a storied history of this regiment.
Okay.
So if you like military history, this is definitely one place to hang out.
Got it.
The next museum is the Royal Regiment of Scotland Museum, and it's a infantry regiment of the British Army. And it's a newer, less historical regiment that they have a museum for. I think this one we skipped because we were starting to get a little tired of military museums.
I was starting to say, and how many museums are in the Edinburgh Castle? Okay, I got it.
Yeah. So we did it actually later in the day. I think you should probably do it earlier in the day so you're not a little bit worn out. So I think I would give that piece of advice as well. So after these military museums, there is the Great Hall. So this is a little bit more from the palace and castle kind of thing versus museums. And in this Great Hall, you will find medieval armor and weapons. So that's interesting to look at. And it won't take you nearly as long to go through as a museum does. So that's nice. You feel like you're moving now. And then past that, there is the Royal Palace. And this is the only place that will have a bit of a line because it houses some of the crown jewels of Queen Mary of Scots, a scepter and a crown. It's not a whole lot of stuff, just a little bit, but now you're into actually where the royals would have lived. And so that'll queue up a little bit as the day goes on. And then past that is the Prisoner of War Museum. And this is more interactive than the other museums. You'll actually walk through where they've kept prisoners over the centuries. And as you can imagine, castles have quote unquote dungeons, so they all have prisons. So they've kept everything in here from pirates to soldiers of the Napoleonic Wars to even the World Wars. They kept prisoners here as well. So throughout its history, prisoners have stayed within the walls of the castle. And then, Chris, really the last stop on the tour of the castle is St. Margaret's Chapel. It is very small. It is from the 12th century, and it is the oldest chapel in the country, if you believe what they put in their information. So it's pretty neat, but it's one room and very small, but it is right at the top of that spiral, if you will. And really after that, now you've seen Edinburgh Castle. And of course, you're going around the edges to see really the views of the city as well.
Okay.
When you're done with the castle, there's still a little bit more to do today. As you're leaving, you come back out past the arena where they're doing the military tattoo. There's a guardhouse actually where you can pick up tickets. And on your right, there is a stairway. It's called the Castle Wynd, W-Y-N-D. It's basically got a street name. And these stairs will take you down to a road that will allow you to walk back behind the castle. And this really gives you excellent views. Now, I'll also say, right as you head down the stairs, there's some public toilets there. So that could be real handy as you're on the Royal Mile as well. But walk down to that main street. And first of all, if you continue to go past that street, the stairs continue, and that takes you into a bunch of restaurants and bars and a little bit of shopping area if you go down the second tier. But I'm just suggesting right now, let's take a walk down that road that goes behind the castle, and you're headed to a place called the Castle Terrace, which is right behind the castle, and it offers, Chris, fantastic views of the castle. I highly recommend getting to Castle Terrace to get really great pictures looking back up at the castle. Some of the better views of the castle, frankly. So it only takes 15 minutes to walk back down around that. You're going downhill, which is nice because you've probably been going uphill a lot of the day. So it's not too bad. And after you've gotten your pictures and enjoyed the castle from that view, you can continue. You're looking clockwise now. You'll walk back into the Princess Street Gardens, and I mentioned that. And that's on the northern side of the castle itself. It's a pretty long park, if you will, and you'll get other great views of the castle as you continue around. And I want to mention that Princess Street, I would say, is really the main drag of the city. The main train station's there, the big hotels are there, more shopping, more restaurants and stuff like that. And in the park, they have ice cream stands and other places where you can sit and get a drink or a small bite of food as well. So that really can encompass day 2.
Okay.
So for a day 3, Chris, I'd say let's start at Holyrood Palace. So we're starting again at the base of the Royal Mile. And the thing to do this day, you got to be in physical shape. We're going to climb Salisbury Crag. And if you don't know what a crag is, which I didn't know what a crag was, but it's pretty easy to figure out once you look at it. It's a steep or rugged cliff or a rock face. So it's a cliff, a bluff, something like that. And this is just to the south of Holyrood Palace. Matter of fact, it's called Holyrood Park. And this gives you great views looking back over the city at the castle. Okay. And to get up to the crag, it's probably a 20-minute hike, and hopefully it hasn't been raining, because if it's been raining, it's going to be muddy. While there's a path, it's a dirt path. It's not concrete or improved, if you will. But it offers a wonderful view of the city from that vantage point. Now, back behind the crag, where you're right kind of on the cliff, is something called Arthur's Seat. And that is the highest
Oh,
peak
sure.
in the area. And that's my Airbnb host said that's about a 45-minute hike. We did not do that this
Okay.
day, but for the hikers in the group and somebody who wants an even higher view where you could probably see the entire bay, the city, the surrounding area, that would be the ultimate. Again, we did this a little later in the day and we were a little bit more tired than let's go do this because we still had some other stuff we wanted to do. We start there with the hike, get the great view, and now we're going to do the rest of the city.
Actually, before you go on, the other thing we should say is that if you do climb Arthur's Seat and you're a history buff, there is a ruins of an old Iron Age fort apparently at the top of Arthur's Seat.
I did not know that. It would make sense because it's the most defendable place in town. There's no doubt. There is no doubt.
Right.
So from the crag, the goal really is we're going to walk across town to something called Calton Hill, Calton. And it has a whole bunch of interesting monuments on it as well. So basically, if you can picture this, we're going to be on the crag, on the cliff. We're going to walk down. We're going to cross the Royal Mile, and then we're going to walk back up. Okay? And the walk back up is not nearly as steep as the walk up the crag. But on your way from the crag to Calton Hill, after you pass the Royal Mile, and this walk probably takes 25 or 30 minutes. I think when I kind of Google mapped it, it was 1 mile, 1.2 miles. It was completely visible between the two. You get a straight shot there. And the first thing you'll pass, or one of the things that you'll pass, is the Burns Monument. And that is dedicated to the poet Robert Burns, another famous Scot. So you'll walk past him as you're getting up to Calton Hill. And he's on the other side of the Royal Mile, just to give you a little bit of location. And then up on the Calton Hill, the things of interest is the National Monument of Scotland. And frankly, it looks like the front of the Parthenon in Athens. It's Greek pillars. My Airbnb host is curious that they built these pillars as the National Monument of Scotland, but okay, it is what it is. And a lot of people like it. A lot of people are climbing on it and taking pictures and stuff like that. But it is a memorial to the Napoleonic Wars for the Scots. It feels a little out of place, frankly. Chris, you said you'd never been to Edinburgh.
To Scotland, way up the top of the list.
When you get there, you might think to yourself, yeah, Dan, it is a little bit out of place, but I'll let you be the judge of that. And then there's another monument called the Nelson Monument. And of course, that's to Admiral Nelson's victory at Trafalgar. The architecture is an upturned telescope. So if you put the fat end of the telescope on the bottom, and then as it gets narrow and narrow, it tells you what the monument actually looks like. So that's up on the hill as well. There's a Portuguese cannon. There's also a cluster of buildings called the Collective. And in the Collective, there's basically some art exhibitions and stuff like that there. I'm sure they run those in and out throughout the year. And there's a restaurant called the Outlook. And while we didn't eat there, basically it would give you wonderful views of the northern part of Edinburgh and into the bay as well. So a very touristy area. More people go here than the crag just because it's more accessible. And there are concrete paths and stuff like that.
Got it.
And then from there, Chris, you would come down and you would stroll Princess Street, again, that main drag. You'll go past Waverley Station, which is the main train station, and that'll bring you to the Scott Monument. It's a Gothic spire that you're going to see when you're up in the castle. You'll see it through various areas of town. It's very prominent. Yeah, and so I thought it was to the Scottish people. It is not. It is to Sir Walter Scott, the writer. They built him a really nice monument, by the way. Yeah.
It's very nice.
And I believe that you can pay to go in and go up 280 steps or something like that and get another view. But if you've been in the castle and you've been on Calton Hill, you've been on the crag, you might not need to burn your efforts and go up into the monument. And then again, on Prince Street, there's the major hotels, frankly, too unaffordable for me, as they have the valets and the guys in the red jackets and stuff like that. Lots of shopping. And this is actually the southern border of what they call the New Town. So the New Town starts at Prince Street and goes towards the bay. And inside of New
Got
Town,
it.
again,
Okay.
is shops, restaurants, hotels, all that kind of stuff. And basically now you've circled the city. You've circled the hill that the castle's on, because we're coming right back into the gardens, into that park. That's how my family spent 3 days in Edinburgh. I'm sure there's other ways to spend your
Okay.
days, but that was, I would say, the big touristy way to do it.
Okay. And then you had a couple day trips you wanted to suggest.
Yep, I sure do. So the first day trip is the train to Stirling. So in Stirling, there is a castle, and a really nice restored castle. So it's a 45-minute train ride. And then also in Stirling, just outside of Stirling, is the National William Wallace Monument. So this is where
Okay.
Braveheart and all that took place. Stirling Castle, like I said, it's a 45-minute train ride, and then you get into town, and it's a small Scottish town. And it's about a 15-minute walk up to the castle, because castles are high and indefensible places, so you always have to walk up to castles. Not a bad walk. You walk through the nice little city of Stirling, and they have all the things you'd want in a little city, but touristy stuff, restaurants and stuff like that. So it's very nice. And the castle is a 12th century castle, and it has a former Renaissance Royals Palace in it as well. It has a great hall, and it too has regimental museums. And the great thing about this
Okay.
castle, even better, I think, than Edinburgh Castle, is the price of admission gets you a tour guide. So there's a tour guide that works for the Scottish Historical Society or whatever society kind of runs that. And he gives you a 1 hour tour of the castle and the history. And it was really good. I was really impressed with the guy. And the thing about this castle is, yes, first it was a castle. Second, it was a palace. And then third, interestingly enough, it became a military barracks, and was a military barracks up until the 70s or something like that. So it's really had
Hmm.
an interesting life. So, for instance, the military, when they took over and there was no more royals living there or anything like that, didn't care about the old kitchens, and they buried those to fortify, and they didn't need those anymore. So they've gone back and they've dug all the rubble out, and they've recreated the kitchens of when the palace had royals there through extravagant parties and such like that. So it has some things like that that are of real interest, and has really nice staterooms that they've redone. And again, you have this tour guide giving you this information. And they even had people in period clothes as you went through the staterooms and stuff. And a lady even like sang, and a minstrel there played a song that you listened to. Really interesting. And you could spend quite a bit of time in there if you talk to all the people and got that information from them. This castle overlooks the River Forth, which is why there's a monument to William Wallace. So as the British were coming up, trying to get into, I'll say, the highlands of Scotland, and this area was of highest military significance, Chris, because it separated the lowlands from the highlands. So it was very strategic back in those days. And while today it's just
Okay.
a river, they said back when William Wallace was hanging out there, and in that time, it was real swampy, and they almost called it a sea. In historical documentation, it was referenced as a sea. So it hadn't been drained yet and just turned into a river. It was very hard to forge across. And there was one bridge here, and this is where William Wallace slaughtered the British, because he attacked them on the bridge. He wasn't the gentleman fighter, he was more of a guerrilla fighter. They were supposed to cross the bridge for William Wallace, and he attacked them on the bridge to some extent. And that's how he won, because he had a much lesser army, but he was able to catch them in a very vulnerable position. That's what our historian told us.
Okay.
To get there, if you're not in a car like us, you would take a bus over to the memorial. So right at that train station, you could take a bus and get to the William Wallace Memorial or Monument. And there you can, of course, climb it. It has 3 exhibition galleries in it, and it has this crown on top. And of course, that gives you the panoramic views. I think it's about 250 steps, spiral staircase up. So it's a tall and slender monument, but it's easy to see from the castle, several miles away.
Okay.
So that makes for a really good day trip, in my opinion.
And then you had one other, but you gave us some choices.
I did. Glasgow is about 45 minutes away on the train if you want to stop there for a day. And St. Andrews is a little over an hour. Now, I can tell you that the British Open was going on while we were there, and I did not want to fight British Open crowds. So I chose to go to Glasgow, and actually my daughter had been studying overseas on a study abroad program, and she had some friends that she met that went to the University of Glasgow. So that gave us another reason to go to Glasgow versus St. Andrews, because I'm sure all the golfers are cussing me right now, asking me why I didn't go during the British Open. But those are the couple of reasons. So both of those would make excellent day trips because, again, they're only about an hour away, and you can do a lot in a 6-hour day in St. Andrews or even Glasgow, although we probably didn't do it justice just doing a day trip, but it worked out fine for us. So that would be my kind of 5-day itinerary using Edinburgh as your home base.
Excellent. Anything else we want to cover before we get to some of our wrap-up questions?
No, I think I'm pretty happy with that.
Excellent. And you know the wrap-up questions. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Edinburgh. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
Yeah, I think I'm on Salisbury Crag, and I'm overlooking the city with just an excellent view. We were there. It was really warm, so there was actually some nice wind there, and you could see the whole city, and it's just a wonderful view. Beautiful.
And you were there in July? Am I remember that correctly?
Early July. Late June, early July, yes.
Okay. And one thing that makes you laugh and say only in Edinburgh.
Yeah, alleyways are called closes, or close.
Okay. And if you had to summarize Edinburgh in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Yeah, I would think beautiful, touristy, and whiskey.
Yep. You say whiskey, but you didn't get into a lot of detail on whiskey. You said the kids were going into whiskey shops.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I remember that wrong. That you were going into whiskey shops. And any particular type of whiskey in a particular shop that you recommend?
No, there are numerous ones of them. They will all give you a tasting, and they all cover really all the big Scottish brands that you may or may not know. So not one specific whiskey, not one specific shop. I can tell you the place that I had it was at the Devil's Advocate. They had a nice whiskey list, and we had what do they call it? A dram of whiskey, or we had that with our lunch. So I would say any, halfway decent, nice restaurant's going to have whiskey there as well. So it's just everywhere, and they are very proud of it, and it is tasty, and you just got to watch yourself with it.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Dan from the Zipping Around the World Travel Podcast. And Dan, what is new on the Zipping Around the World Travel Podcast?
Yeah, so I'm actually just finishing up. We did a whole English tour this summer, and Edinburgh is one of my episodes, and I'm just finishing that up right now. So that's out. And Chris, I'm only about 700 episodes behind you.
I don't know if I'll give you the chance to catch up or not, but I think I'm going to keep going for a little while.
Yeah, I don't think I'll ever catch you, but you are my hero, and I listen to your podcast every week, and I've used it quite a bit for my own travels.
That's the thing I like to hear.
Yep, I have absolutely used it for my travels. The Hong Kong one I used wholeheartedly.
Excellent. And Dan, thanks so much for coming on Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for Edinburgh.
Yep, I certainly appreciate it, Chris.
Thanks, as always, to the patrons of the show who help support Amateur Traveler financially. If you're interested in becoming a patron of the show or just want to know more, go to patreon.com/amateurtraveler. We're at the second round of voting in the Amateur Traveler Facebook group, amateurtraveler.com/trips, the private Facebook group where we talk about Amateur Traveler trips. And we're voting on both 2023 and 2024 and where we'll go. If you hear this when it comes out and react quickly, you may be able to have a say. And with that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.